This video is going to show how to pick up stitches along the neckline, and this really is the most important part of the finishing, because if the neckline does not look right, you are not going to want to wear it. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Now when you're picking up stitches, you have two types of areas. You have stitches that you're going to be picking up in, and there's a bound off edge. And so I'm going to be picking up in the stitch below the bound off edge, and it's going to close up these holes where I've got my bound off holes. And you might think, oh, if I pick up a stitch in there it'll close the hole. No, it just makes it bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up stitches. This is a bound off stitch, this is a bound off stitch, this is a bound off stitch, and then I have rows. And I'm going to pick up the stitches for the front first, and I don't have that many rows. Now when you're picking up for rows, because there are more rows in an inch than there are stitches, you can't use the same ratio to pick up. I cannot pick up one stitch for every row. Generally the ratio that is recommended, and I'm probably going to use on this one, is for every 4 rows I'm going to pick up 3 stitches. And what that means is the rows are represented by these horizontal bars, and so I'll pick up in here, I'll pick up in here, I'll pick up in here, and then I'll skip those 2. Well, actually I'm not going to do that because we'll see what we do when we get there. And this is more of an art than a science. So actually this is just such a little short piece here. I'll probably pick up 1 stitch for every row. Now once I get down to here, I'm going to stop the video and pause it, and then I'll pick up again when I get on the back where I do have a lot of rows, and we can see how we're picking up stitches. Now when you start, you want to pick up a stitch as close to the seam as you can. Where I'm going to be picking up is I'm going to be picking up in the column between in the horizontal bars between my selvage stitch, which is my seam allowance, and the first column of stitches. So I'm going to insert my needle kind of like in the seam itself almost. And I'm going to leave a long tail because I'm going to use that to kind of fix that, make it nice and neat when I'm done. And I've got that seaming thread right there. And I'm going to go ahead and pick up a stitch in these rows. So I'm going to pick up a stitch. There's my horizontal bar there. And you want to make sure you don't pick up, and you don't drop your needle. You don't pick up stitches in the center of a column of stitches. And remember, the center of a column of stitches is a V. So I'm going to go over here and pick up. And by the way, if you want to see the photos of this and more information, go to my blog, and I have an index, and there'll be one in there called Picking Up Stitches that will go into much more detail. And you may want to look at that actually, because it will be on a smoother yarn. So I'm going to pick up here. Now normally you'd think I would pick up right here, but that is where I've bound off a stitch. And if I pick up here, it's going to make that hole big. So I'm going to skip to the stitch below my bound off edge, and because these were just 1 stitches that were bound off, they're kind of hard to see. And there's my next one, and I'm going to jump. It's going to look horrible. I think, oh no, this isn't going to work. I'm going to jump all the way down to here where my next bound off stitch is. Bound off, and then I'm going to jump down here. And what that's going to do, and when I finish this, when I have this whole thing all finished, I'll do a video to show you how this is going to look. Okay, now there's my last bound off stitch right there. And this is where I joined that other side, and I told you, oh, it's going to look awful. You think, oh, it's never going to work. Well, I'm going to pick up a stitch right here, and you can see that I'm going to get a smooth edge when I'm all done with this. Okay, now as promised, I'm going to put this on hold, on pause it until I get over here to do the other side of the neck, because that way I can show you some different things. Okay, I've picked up the stitches along the front of the neck, and I'm back to where I've got my stair steps. So we'll do that again. And I'm going to pick up at the top of the stitch right below the bind off edge. And make sure before you start to finish that you can recognize those things. Here's a stitch that's been bound off. I'm going to jump up to it. There's one. It's a column of stitches. And finishing, it's very important that you understand what stitches look like. Otherwise, it's hard to see where you should be positioning your needle. And here's one of those stitches that I bound off, and it may look like I'm doing this randomly, but I'm not. I bound off those stitches so I know that they're there. And I'm going to skip that great big old hole where my vertical and horizontal edges join. Oops, got all these yarn tails, those will be woven in later. And let's see, got one there. And I'm getting near the seam, and it's kind of hard to see where to place these stitches when you're in the seam. You just basically do the best you can, get to the other side of the seam and hope that everything works out. Okay, now I'm on the other side of the seam. This is that part of the back where I have a lot of rows because I've done that deep back, and I cannot pick up one stitch for every row or it's going to be puckered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up 1, 2, 3 in that space between the first column of stitches and the second using those horizontal bars, and then I'm going to skip. I'm going to go over 2 bars. 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to skip 2 bars. 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to skip 2 bars. 1, 2. Let's see. And I'm just going to continue on in that fashion until I'm all done. Now, like I said, when I'm finished with all of this, I'll show you how it looks. That is exactly the same procedure I'm going to use for the armholes. When I pick up stitches for the armholes, remember the stitches I've bound off? I'm going to pick up those stitches, and then I'm going to use the same ratio, 3 stitches for every 4 rows when I pick up for the armholes.